Morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. 5th of July. Setting up for the Outsiders. First dog will be a separate broadcast.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not.
True dat. Our guest this morning, comfortably here in the Melbourne studios, Dr. Gazarian. He's politics lecturer, Monash University, co-author of Australian Politics for Dummies. So he's in the right place.
Good morning.
Jason Potts joins you too from the School of Economics, Finance and Marketing at RMIT. He's also an adjunct fellow of the IPA. Welcome, Jason.
Good morning.
Well, the conversation, I think it would be fair to say, was derailed somewhat this week, and a standout contender in that derailment was Eric Abbott's.
I don't think the Australian people want it. It's not a high-order issue. And like with the Republic debate, people, when they went to the referendum, scratched their heads and said, what on earth are we doing voting on an issue like this when we've got more important issues at stake? How is it that our national leaders can become so distracted?
Same-sex marriage is, of course, that issue. Jason, this goes to the core of the great division in conservative politics, does it not, between social conservatives and those firm believers in individual liberty above all else? That's kind of the division here.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it plays into that. But I think the broader issue here that we're sort of trying to tap into is this is being framed as a discussion about equality, and it's breaking on either side of that. But the broader issue is just, why is government even involved in this at all? In the requirement of marriage licenses and the ability to offer that.
That's an interesting point. And Zara, why is government, if it's involved in this, why is it so lagging in sort of public sentiment? Why is it so reluctant to act on what's obviously, I think, the will of the people in this?
It's a really interesting point. Jason's point is entirely valid. Obviously, there are going to have to be legislative changes to allow marriage equality to take place. That's really what is agitating and developing this debate further. But you get this sense that the government, in particular Mr. Abbott as Prime Minister, is really hesitant to touch this issue because he knows that within his own party there is a rump of coalition members who are going to be very upset if he changes his mind and becomes much more progressive leaning. But even in Parliament itself, they still don't have the numbers to pass changes to this bill. So it suggests to us that there is a real deep conservatism throughout both major parties.
And that goes back a way. Here's a former major conservative leader.
What we did 10 years ago was not to change the Act so much as insert for the first time a definition in the Act. A marriage was between a man and a woman. Up until that time, it had never been seriously questioned. That's what it meant. Has my position changed? No, it hasn't. I remain a very strong supporter of the status quo. The question of whether the Liberal Party allows a free vote is a matter for the current Prime Minister and the current members of the Parliamentary Liberal Party. I'm no longer a member of Parliament. I'm quite happy to express my view. I make no apology for that view.
Interesting, Jason, that at least John Howard had the sort of courage to nail his colours to the mast legislatively. And that's something we're seeing in this government, is that sort of reluctance to take that firm position and to legislate it.
Well, in a sense, why should they?
And not just on this issue, I should say. I mean, it's a more broader version.
Just going back to this point about, why government is even involved in this. I mean, this is somehow we've completely normalised the idea that we need government permission to marry. And then there's going to be differences of opinion among any reasonable people on this. But if you go back to the history of where this even came from, the involvement in this, the origins of government involvement in marriage have got some really murky past. It goes back to government control over breeding and very racist origins to this. And that was back in the early part of the 20th century. And somehow that origin, we've completely normalized this, and now the question is become.
And yet we do have a Marriage Act,
Well, we do, and we've had this since 1961, and before that, it was an issue for the states to decide themselves how they felt about that. So we've made this political, and I think the issue is either we just treat this as exactly the second order issue that it should be, and just have a vote on it. People can disagree whatever they like, but the idea that we all have to arrive at some consensus, and that this consensus has to exist within a political party, just feels.
Is that a thing, Zara, that is blocking the push for reform in various areas? I mean, we get very caught up on the division. We don't find it very easy to sort of see a path through.
It is, and Australian politics over the last decade or two really has become you're either with us or you're against us on a range of issues, whether it's marriage equality, whether it's climate change, whether it's the GST. The whole thing it's so polarized that there is no space to have a deeper discussion. So it becomes black and white. Whereas I think there's potential for voices, not necessarily on this particular issue, but on other sorts of policies.
But strangely, that's the potential of this issue. I mean, we saw this week the revelation that we had across the party lines, private members coming together on this bill, that there'd been that sort of sense of conversation across the aisle on this.
Yes, yep.
It could almost be a template for how we might address a range of issues if we can have that conversation.
It sure could. But I would suspect the power brokers within the parties themselves would really hate that sort of approach because it takes away their oxygen to advance their rigid agendas, whatever they may be.
It all comes down to politics, doesn't it, Jason? I mean, the other thing we saw this week too was revelations that pre-budget in the committee stages, the expenditure review committee stages formulating the budget, we had serious consideration given around superannuation tax reform. Papers brought in from Treasury, obvious debate there within that committee, and yet that being knocked on the head politically. Again, this issue of the politics coming first, that that risk aversion being the sort of the determining factor around these issues.
Yeah, I think this is part of the same issue here, where the government or each party needs to have its own view on these things, and we can't have individuals chasing their own agendas.
Individuals chasing their own agendas may be a neat segue to the situation on the Mediterranean. And of course, today we've been discussing how Greece is going to the polls to vote in this plebiscite, this referendum today, yes or no. And that, Jason, your economic background, this is an invidious position. There's no real win out of yes or no, and it's a very divided people that will take that vote.
Yeah, I mean, there's no happy outcome to the end of Sunday here. But I think what's interesting about this is the way that this whole thing has been framed as a Greece versus Europe, or Greece versus Germany, or a thing that's happening to Greece, as if there is this one unified Greek perspective on this. Whereas what this really looks like to me is basically a civil war within Greece. There are those who derive their incomes from government, and then there are those who derive their income from the market, from the tourism sector. And when you look closely at who's angry with who, this is much more about a bloated, corrupt public sector that's gotten out of control to the point that it's actively, seriously harming the Greek lives and Greek businesses within that. And it's come to a flashpoint now. It's taken Germany to do this, or the IMF, but...
And there's so much investment from the participants in that bloated public sector.
Yeah, well, everyone has a lot to lose on this. There's no way that this ends happily.
And Zara, the community divided on those grounds, those engaged in that part, but also on an age basis as well. We know the polling, yes or no, is fairly evenly split.
That's right, yeah.
So it's hard to see how, whatever happens out of this referendum, how Greece picks itself up, dusts itself off, and moves on into the next week and thereafter.
It's a real challenge for the country, and it also goes to the heart of sovereignty. The Greek nation is actually... their sovereignty is being challenged by their creditors. This is a very interesting development in politics and international affairs, where those who have a significant financial investment are seeking to change the way the government of the country structured its policies and its approach to basically everything.
I wonder, Jason, I mean, that's an interesting point and goes to that structure of the European Union. I wonder if that goes to some of the subtext around the sort of trade negotiations we see having now too, that interesting balance between international corporate interest and the interests of sovereign governments is a thing that's very much in play on a lot of fronts.
Yeah, well, and that's clearly going on here. So we can see that. But again, in this notion, and this is like the thing that happened this week was that the Prime Minister called for a referendum on this to try and get a plebiscite, to get popular support behind this. And again, this is trying to drag, to try and make it appear as if there's a unified perspective coming from the Greek people. And that's clearly not the case.
That has
They've
failed.
been drawn into that, and it's shocking to see.
It'll be very hard for the government to act without at least trying to consult the people, though, on this issue. This is a government that came to power with the view of changing politics, changing the way that the Greek debt crisis and the whole economic crisis was affecting Greece. They would be, in effect, very silly to go without consulting the citizens. But having said that, there's questions about not the validity, but the clarity of the question that is being asked for citizens now. Do they understand the question? I think there are reports that many of them don't. And that will also have some impact on the final result.
Well, it's not a simple yes/no question, really, is it, Jason? And those answers have a range of implication, which aren't carried in the binary choice. It's
Well, I mean, what's at issue here is the consequences of a default, and what a default does is it ruins Greece's credit rating. It has implications for future taxes that will occur within Greeks for the Greek citizens, and the question is just, are they willing to go down that path, and who is going to bear the costs of that? And what this looks like is, whatever happens, there's going to be a lot of pain. It's just how this is distributed, whether it's distributed to future taxpayers, whether it falls upon the government's inability to borrow subsequently, whether this pushes them out of the union and therefore in search of their own currency.
That thing of sovereignty is that I think that increasing that's a fascinating example, the fascinating aspect of this.
I think it is. I really do, and it also will set a precedent if Greece does default, and there has been talk about the domino effect. We know that other EU countries have a lot of debt; they're carrying a lot of debt. Will they also be able to take, if, for example, Greece does default, will they be able to take that as precedent and also not make repayments to their creditors? I think that if that happens, then there's a whole heap of other sorts of questions that come up.
And Jason, what does it say about the possibilities of a union of sovereign interests that may have so many differing approaches to that union, that may have so many different approaches to issues like austerity? I mean, is it possible to group people in that sort of collection over the long term?
Well, the EU is an aspirational project, and I think part of the anger that's coming out of the IMF, for example, on this was that they were misled. Greece cooked the books coming in, and they've admitted this now. So there's a certain sense of righteous anger coming from the creditors on this. I think to paint them as the villains, entirely as the villains, is a bit misleading on this.
Yes, they have been naughty boys.
They have been, and this is really about, can the political parties or the political leadership of Greece reform at this point, and that's in a sense what this referendum is about, whether they've got the population behind them on this to undertake this event.
And I guess, Zara, that sense too of whether politics actually is truthful, whether it can foster that sort of miscomprehension on the part of people to this sort of point of pain.
That's right, and I think, as Jason points out, there have been some dodgy things happening in terms of managing the finances of the country. But what is also very interesting and raises questions is, if Greece does decide today what it wants to do in terms of leaving the euro, doing whatever it is to try and pay back the debt, whatever the case may be, how will they go forward? Will their liberal democratic tradition be affected by what is left after today?
There are some pretty big questions, and yes or no is just the beginning of them. Look, not many hours to wait for at least that first one to be resolved.
Okay, coming up on the upload limit, so I will end this video now and recommence with the dag end of Outsiders and the commencement of the first dog on the moon.